This is a review of Spanish 2, every single concept that we've learned. And you can use this as a reference when you're studying for the final exam, and also, hopefully, when you're practicing Spanish outside of class. The concept that we learned was affirmative and negative sentences. Affirmative sentences state a fact or opinion, like, I like ice cream. Negative sentences negate a fact or opinion, like, I don't like ice cream. To make any affirmative sentence negative, put a no before the verb and change any affirmative words in the sentence to the negative version of that word. To make a negative sentence affirmative, get rid of the no and change any negative words in the sentence to the affirmative version of that word. Here's a list of all the affirmative and negative words. Tenemos algún and ningún, and these words are special because their ending changes to match the noun that they're talking about. Algún means some, ningún means none. So if I said I have some friends, I could say tengo algunos amigos. Since amigos is plural and masculine, algún becomes algunos. Alguien means somebody, and nadie means nobody. Algo means something, and nada means nothing. Siempre means always, nunca means never. También means also, and tampoco means neither. To form the present progressive, you need two things. First, you need to conjugate the verb estar in the present tense. And just as a reminder, here are the conjugations for estar in the present tense. Estoy, estás, está, estamos, estáis, están. Once you have the conjugated form of estar, then you can move on to the second part of the present progressive, which is the verb that you actually want to communicate. This verb is in the gerund form, in other words, ing. In Spanish, the gerund ends in ando for AR verbs and yendo for ER and IR verbs. Then we learned about saber and conocer. Saber is used when you're talking about knowing information. So you use saber when you see question words like who, what, when, where, why. And also with verbs in the infinitive, because you can use saber for saying knowing how to do something. Here are the conjugations of saber. Sé, sabe, sabe, sabemos, sabéis, saben. You use conocer more like to be familiar with something or someone. So conocer is only used with nouns. That's people, places, things, and ideas. The conjugations of conocer are conozco, conoces, conoce, conocemos, conocéis, conocen. Now for reflexive verbs. Reflexive verbs are used when the person doing the action is also the person receiving the action. For example, I brush my hair. Whose hair am I brushing? Mine. That makes it a reflexive verb. To conjugate a reflexive verb, you need to take the reflexive pronoun se and change it to match the subject of the sentence. Here's an example with the verb vestir. Me visto, te vistes, se viste, nos vestimos, os vestís, y se visten. On the same slide, we're going to talk about reciprocal actions also. Reciprocal actions are basically reflexive verbs, except two or more people are doing the action to each other. So instead of me hugging myself, it's me and my friend hugging each other. And since there's two or more people, you don't really have yo, tú, or el, ella, usted conjugations. It's just nosotros, vosotros, or ellos, ellas, ustedes. But the conjugations are the same as reflexive verbs. Now for possessive adjectives. A possessive adjective expresses whom something belongs to, like this is mine, or that's yours. The first part of the adjective corresponds to the person owning the object. You use me if something belongs to me, tú if something belongs to you, suy if something belongs to him or her, nuestro if something belongs to us, vuestro if something belongs to y'all in Spain, and suy if it belongs to them. The second part of the adjective, the ending, corresponds to the number and gender of the object itself. So here I have the endings as O, because I don't know what object we're talking about, but it changes based on that object. So if we're talking about pizza, which is singular and feminine, mio would become mia. And if we were talking about perros, which is masculine and plural, mio would become mios. The imperfect tense is one of two past tenses in Spanish. The imperfect tense is used for things that go on for a long period of time or continue going on right now. A helpful way to remember the imperfect tense is hog sweat. Habitual actions, ongoing actions, growing up, setting the scene, weather, emotions, age, and telling time. The imperfect tense is also used for interrupted actions. In other words, actions that were going on in the background when something else happened. Here are the conjugations for the imperfect tense. Estaba, here are the conjugations with the verb estar. Estaba, estabas, estaba, estábamos, estabais, y estaban. And here are the conjugations with tener, which is an ER verb. Tenía, tenías, tenía, teníamos, teníais, tenían. There are only 3 irregular verbs in the imperfect: ser, ir, and ver. Ser goes era, eras, era, éramos, erais, eran. Ir goes iba, ibas, iba, íbamos, ibais, iban. And ver goes veía, veías, veía, veíamos, veíais, veían. Comparisons of inequality in Spanish 1. Comparisons of inequality compare two unlike things, like more than or less than. Typically, a comparison of inequality follows this format. Thing 1 or person 1, es, más o menos, and then an adjective, que, thing 2 or person 2. The adjective should match thing 1. For example, yo soy más alta que tú. Also, if you're comparing objects, like how many of something that you have, it's person 1 or thing 1, tiene, más o menos, and then the noun, the object, que, and then person 2 or thing 2. For example, yo tengo más gatos que tú. There are some irregular comparisons of inequality. Older is mayor, younger is menor, better is mejor, and worse is peor. And when you use an irregular comparison of inequality, it follows this format. Thing 1 or person 1, es, and then you use the irregular, like es mayor que, or es menor que, and then person 2. Of equality compare two equal things, like he is as nice as she is, or I have as many cats as you do. The format of comparisons of inequality looks like this. Thing 1 or person 1, es tan, and then an adjective, como, thing 2, or person 2. The adjective matches thing 1. So if I said, I am as tall as you, I would say, yo soy tan alta como tú. And then if you're talking about objects, you use thing 1 or person 1, tiene, tanto, and then the noun, como, and then thing 2 or person 2. The word tanto changes number and gender to match the noun. So, for example, if I said, I have as many sisters as you, it would be yo tengo tantas hermanas como tú. Superlatives express the best, worst, or most of something. Typically, superlatives follow this pattern. First, you have the article el, la, los, or las. Then you have the noun, más, the adjective, de, and then whatever you're comparing, the class, the neighborhood, the country, the world. Here's my example. Yo tengo el perro más bonito del mundo. I have the prettiest dog in the world. Of course, there are some irregular superlatives also. Older is mayor, younger is menor, better is mejor, and worse is peor. And when you have a new regular superlative, you put the article, then the irregular superlative, and then the noun, and then they and whatever you're comparing it to. So, if I said she's the best dog or he's the best dog in the world, es el mejor perro del mundo. Demonstratives express which object you're talking about out of a selection of objects. This is este, that is ese, and that one way over there is aquel. Demonstratives change to match the number of and the gender of the noun they're describing. So if we talked about this pizza, since pizza is feminine, it's esta pizza. And if we're talking about those boys, boys are masculine and plural, it would be esos chicos. Direct object pronouns replace direct objects. A direct object answers the question what or who in a sentence. So if the sentence is I won the game, the question is what did I win? And the answer is the game. That means the game is the direct object. Direct object pronouns replace the direct object. So instead of saying I won the game, we can be lazy and say I won it. These are the direct object pronouns in Spanish: me, te, lo or la, nos, os, los, and las. In Spanish, direct object pronouns go before the conjugated verb. If you have multiple verbs back to back, you can also put it at the end of the infinitive. So, for example, I won the game would be lo gané. We're going to win is vamos a ganarlo. An indirect object answers the question to whom or for whom in a sentence. For example, I wrote this letter for you. You would be the indirect object because it answers the question for whom is the letter. Indirect object pronouns replace indirect objects in a sentence. In Spanish, indirect object pronouns are me, te, le, nos, os, and les. In Spanish, indirect object pronouns go before the conjugated verb. But if you have multiple verbs back to back, you can also put it at the end of the infinitive. If you have a direct object pronoun and an indirect object pronoun in the same sentence, the indirect object pronoun comes before the direct object pronoun. If the indirect object pronoun is le or les and you have a direct object pronoun, the indirect object pronoun changes to se. The preterite tense is one of two past tenses in Spanish. It's used to express one-time actions, completed actions, actions that are completed within a time frame, a sequence of events, and interrupting actions. The endings for AR verbs in the preterite tense are aste, o, amos, astes, aron. And for ER and IR verbs, it's iste, yo, imos, istes, yeron. Of irregular verbs in the preterite tense, and there are lots of different categories that they fall under. The most common irregular preterite verbs are in the irregular stem song. You know, the one that goes ise, quise, vine, yo. We also have ir, ser, and ver that are all irregular. There's also verbs that end in car, gar, and thar that change to que, gue, and ce in the yo form. We also have stem-changing verbs in the el, ella, and ellos, ellas form, and verbs that change from I to Y. I strongly recommend watching the irregular preterite video one more time before you take the exam. So then we learned about Affirmative Tú Commands. Affirmative Tú Commands tell a friend, family member, or peer what to do. To make an Affirmative Tú command, you conjugate the verb in the el, ello, usted form in the present tense. If you have a pronoun, attach it to the end of the command and put an accent on the third to last syllable. There are some irregular Affirmative Tú commands, and they're all in this list. Venir es ven, decir es di, salir es sal, hacer es haz, tener es ten, ir es ve, poner es pon, and ser es se. You can remember them as ven, di, sal, haz, ten, ve, pon, se. Now on to preterite versus imperfect. Interrupted actions, which are conjugated in the imperfect tense, are things that were going on when an interrupting action stops them. The interrupting action is conjugated in the preterite tense. The imperfect tense is used to set up the story, describing people, telling what time it was, describing the weather, telling somebody's age, etc. Meanwhile, preterite tells the story. It's the actions of the story. Negative Tú commands tell a friend, family member, or peer what not to do. To form a negative Tú command, you start with the yo form of the verb in the present tense. Then you drop the o at the end. And finally, you add the opposite ending. For er and ir verbs, that's as. And for ar verbs, it's es. There are a few irregular negative Tú commands. Ir becomes no vayas, and ser becomes no seas. And finally, if you have a pronoun, it goes between the no and the command. Affirmative Usted commands tell somebody respectfully what to do. To form an affirmative Usted command, it's very similar to a negative Tú command. You start with the yo form of the verb in the present tense. Then you drop the o and you add the opposite ending. The only difference is you don't use the s, so the opposite ending is just a for er and ir verbs and e for ar verbs. If you have a pronoun, attach it to the end of the command and put an accent on the third to last syllable. Usted commands tell somebody respectfully what not to do. To form a negative Usted command, you start with the yo form of the verb in the present tense, and then you drop the o. And finally, you add the opposite ending, which is a for er and ir verbs and e for ar verbs. If you have a pronoun, it goes between the no and the command. Affirmative Ustedes commands are used to tell a group of people what to do. To form an affirmative Ustedes command, you start with the yo form of the verb in the present tense. Then you drop the o. And finally, you add the opposite ending. But the opposite ending is different because it's an for ar and ir verbs and en for ar verbs. If you have a pronoun, attach it to the end of the command and put an accent on the third to last syllable. And finally, we have negative Ustedes commands. Negative Ustedes commands are used to tell a group of people what not to do. To form one, you start with the yo form of the verb in the present tense. Then you drop the o and add the opposite ending, which is an for er and ir verbs and en for ar verbs. If you have a pronoun, it goes between the no and the command. Os deseo mucha suerte en el examen.